I talked to Fiona. Her story is truly an incredible one. Fiona has two children, and the journey from her first birth to her second is quite the tale. Her first baby was diagnosed with omphalocele. That's when some of the baby's inner organs have stayed outside of the body while in utero. This all happened during the mess of 2020, so to spare herself greater trauma of potentially birthing completely alone, Fiona chose to have a cesarean section for the delivery of her child. Fiona was separated from her baby straight away, and as her newborn was in the care of medical providers to be prepped for surgery, the medical staff overdosed her tiny infant and almost killed him. It wasn't until 3 days after birth that Fiona was finally able to hold her newborn child and wasn't able to breastfeed until 1 week later. Needless to say, his journey into life was traumatic, as was Fiona's, but I'm going to leave the rest of that story here so that you can hear it from Fiona's words how all that experience went for her. I will say, though, that Fiona took her power back when she got pregnant for the second time and chose to birth her second child completely free of the medical system. Even when her placenta stayed within her womb for 36 hours, Fiona had trust that it would emerge when it was ready to do so, and it did. Please sit back and really listen to this amazing story of Fiona truly going through hell with her first birth to come into such a great redemption with her second. Hello, Fiona. Welcome to the Free Birthing in Color movement. I'm so grateful to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for you too and the opportunity to share my stories.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited to get into it. I know you have some really powerful stories to share. So let's just get straight into this. And the first question I want to ask is, what is your ancestry and lineage that you're passing on to your children?
Zimbabwean. So my mum is mixed race from Zimbabwe. I grew up in the UK, so my father is English, and yeah, there's a mix from my mum of Zimbabwean, English as well, which goes back to obviously the colonization, and then somewhere sort of in the Indian Ocean. So I know one of her grandmothers, they think was from maybe Mauritius, or she had very long hair, but there's a bit of a bit of sort of ambiguity around it. No one's quite sure exactly with everything, so there's a bit of a big mix.
Okay.
Wow,
that's cool. That's Mauritius. That's more in like South Pacific, right? Like the Pacific Islander.
I think in between I think it's in between Africa and India, like in that India.
Oh, okay, that's
I'm
right.
really
Okay.
I wasn't great at geography.
No, I'm
but
trying
yeah,
to see it
it's
on a
in
map.
that.
Like, is it down there?
I'm
Is it...
sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
just
Wow.
somewhere there. So
Yeah.
she doesn't think she was full Indian, but there's something there about that sort of like within those kind of
Wow.
islands. So
Fascinating.
yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing. Excuse me. And then the second question I love asking is, where does your motherhood journey begin?
So that takes us back to 2019. And I started getting that real pull. It was, messages from my spirit baby that now is the time. So I'd never really been, sort of really definite about wanting to be a mother. And it wasn't something that I'd always planned. It just sort of wasn't on my radar. I was just having loads of fun. Me and my partner were just living our best lives, sort of. It just wasn't there before, and I hadn't contemplated it. But then I really started getting these messages that now's the time. So I started following Kundalini conscious conception sort of journey with meditations and the yoga, sort of communicating with that spirit baby calling in the soul, just getting some prep work done to, sort of be ready rather than just kind of, just trying for a baby without doing some of the spiritual work. So that was, maybe I think about 5-6 months of that journey. And then I conceived in July of 2019. So I wasn't 100% sure about my dates. I sort of hadn't been tracking like fertility awareness, that kind of thing. So I went to the doctor and she was very, like, we need to know these dates. We've got to have all this information, obviously the start of like pathologizing everything. And I really hadn't like had much experience of other friends having had babies and, giving me stories of what they had done. So it's just kind of like, okay, well, this seems like pretty important. I must need to, go and have this dating scan so that they can figure out exactly what date it is and all of that sort of thing. So I did, and I think at that point I went along, and it was I guessed that my gestation was around 6 weeks.
Okay.
But at the time, the ultrasound technician made a comment about the heartbeat of my baby, and that it was a bit wasn't fast enough, a bit slow. So immediately that put this fear into me, like, what's wrong with my baby? Like, is everything going to be okay? So went home, and that was like really weighing on my heart and on my mind for a long time. And then like all of the symptoms that I'd started feeling started to sort of go away. So, like the tenderness, breast tenderness, all that sort of thing was sort of going down. And then I started to think, you know, is something going wrong here? Am I losing my baby? Like, I don't feel as pregnant anymore. So this kind of went on for a few weeks, and then I started like spotting, and there was some blood, and it didn't look new, but then I didn't know what it was, and I really didn't know sort of who to turn to. And then as I was approaching that sort of end of the first trimester and coming up to, I think it was like within a week or so of that 12-week scan, I'd started to then bleed quite a bit more, like noticeably, and I immediately thought that I was having a miscarriage. So what had been said to me before about the heartbeat and all. So I went to my GP, and she really said, like, there's nothing that you can do, just wait for that scan, because that's the only way that we can tell, sort of what's going on, but just go home and rest. So went home, took some days off work, was on, sort of bed rest, but really just started feeling like that was the end of that journey. So we went in, my partner and I, to the hospital, because normally you would go and get that scan done at a private place, but it just so happened that the hospital had some appointments available, and I'd been able to get in there. And I'd enrolled already in the MGP, so the midwifery group practice. And then I was due to have like my first appointment with the midwives a couple of weeks after the scan. So went in, and immediately she started scanning, and there was a really strong heartbeat. So there was this absolute relief, like, my baby's breathing, like, he's alive. So yeah, she just then was taking a really long time going over things. Like, it seemed like a long time. I've never had a 12-week scan before, but it just seemed like it was going on for ages. And she then just made a little comment about something about around the abdominal area, that she's seeing something wrong there. She thinks there's some organs that aren't in place. So, and that she had to go and find a doctor. So off, this technician went and just left us in the room, and she was gone for about 40 minutes. So we were just sat there, like, really, it was the Friday before a long weekend. So I think, most people had gone home, and she's desperately trying to find the right person, to speak to. So I started, like, what's going on. So I started Googling to try and find out what this could possibly be. And the two things that were coming up were omphalocele and gastroschisis. So I already started, sort of checking on that. So then she comes back with a doctor, well, two actually, but one of them never introduced themselves. So I've later come to know that the one doctor that was speaking to me was a fellow from the MGM, sorry, not MGM, MFM, so maternal fetal medicine, but she was like in training. So I think the other doctor was actually just observing her, because he had a notepad and was just writing things, but never actually said who he was and what he was doing. It was just very kind of like lurking around in the shadows.
Right. Okay.
So she came in and started to explain, and I said, are we talking about like an omphalocele or gastroschisis? And she kind of rolled her eyes at me and made a comment like, oh, well, I see that you've already consulted Dr. Google.
That's so
and it was
rude.
just kind of like, well, I'm not sure what you expected that I was going to be doing for the 40 minutes that we've been sat in here, like just scrolling through Facebook or something. Like, we're
Exactly.
obviously a bit worried about this and we want to know.
Yeah.
Um, so she started getting into, sort of telling me all about it. And within this conversation, she mentioned termination about 4 times, 4 or 5 times.
Seriously.
So, yeah, so she just kept going on and, saying like, oh, quite often there are genetic abnormalities that accompany this. Like, we would have to do some tests, we'd need to do an amniocentesis. And already, like, I knew what one of those was. And I was like, no, like, no one's sticking a needle anywhere, near me. And then she'd sort of like downgrade from that and say, oh, we could, just test the placenta instead. And I was like, no one's coming near me with any needles. And then I said, well, what's the least invasive thing that we can do? And she said, well, take my blood and then test for, abnormalities. So doing that harmony test.
Mm-hmm.
So I agreed to that.
Mm-hmm.
But she just she'd sort of go around in circle and then say, but some people choose to terminate. And I was just getting really worked up and almost to the point where I like wanted to punch her if she said
Yeah,
it one more
fair.
time because
I would be the same way.
so agreed to go and get that test done, and like it was just within time that I could go to the pathology area because it hadn't closed yet and go and get it done before the weekend. So she promised to then call me with the results when they were in the following week.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a long weekend. We're really I'd been expecting that I was going to be able to like call my mum and dad and let them know because we'd sort of kept everything a bit of a secret. Like we live in Australia, but our parents are in the UK. So both sets of our parents, and we kind of kept it a secret because, no one sees me regularly when we're Skyping, like I can keep it above the, sort of thing. But then we weren't able to do this because we felt like, I don't know, like what's actually happening. We don't know. We'd rather find out what the deal is and if there are any genetic abnormalities. So we waited for the long weekend. Tuesday came, no phone call. And I'd like called up the hospital and they're like, oh no, she's on a conference. Sorry, we can't get a message to you. Okay, well, when are these results due in? Oh, we don't know. And then the next day, so then I went to my GP and she then tried to contact her thinking that she might have a bit more, sort of, a bit more influence in getting through to somebody, but still couldn't, couldn't get hold of her. Turns out she hadn't filled out the paperwork properly. So my test results hadn't even come back from, because they have to go to a specialized genetics lab, not just sort of the one within the hospital. So finally got to the bottom of that they wouldn't release any results, like they hadn't even sent them back because the paperwork hadn't been done properly. So had to get that all signed and sent off again. And then the following Friday, so a whole week later, I still hadn't heard anything. So I just drove to the hospital and went to the department and said, I'm not leaving until somebody gives me my results. Like I knew that the genetics lab had sent them.
Okay, yeah.
And they were at the hospital and it was just like, somebody has to tell me. So I just like stood firm. And then a doctor came along and sort of opened up the things and started going through. And to my relief, there's no, genetic abnormality. It was all very, sort of normal, like 99.9%. Yeah, sure that there's no trisomies. So complete relief there. Was just overjoyed, called my partner that weekend, called our parents, let them know, like super excited. But then I was then told that I couldn't go through the MGP that I had been enrolled in. I was basically kicked out of that, and that my only option there was to go to one of two main hospitals there in Sydney that have a big maternal fetal medicine department and then a children's hospital attached to the women's hospital, basically. So
and why was that though? Because he
had an omphalocele. Sorry, I hadn't even got to that. So part of his liver and part of his intestine were outside of his body, but in the umbilical. So basically, like where organs start to develop outside, but then they migrate in, and then the abdominal wall closes up by like week 10 or something like that.
Yeah.
That hadn't happened for him. So those organs were protruding. So
Okay.
it
Okay.
was then this start of massive surveillance on my pregnancy. It was
Right.
just
So
kind of like,
then,
okay,
yeah, that's why
yeah,
they stopped you with the midwifery group because you were,
yes,
deemed high risk. I'm
high risk.
assuming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I see. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks later, I was off to this other hospital, and it from there on in, it just started, and it was, sort of, I was really made to believe like these scans were so imperative, and like
Mm.
they needed to do it. So every 4 weeks, I had to go in. But looking back at it now, like I really don't think that they were necessary. I think it's really just so that MFM fellow can get some more ultrasound, sort of practice and basically tick off like they've done however many ultrasounds they need to in order to qualify as their specialized doctor.
Yeah,
But
totally.
it was made to me. They made it out to me like it was really important. So it was just this constant like fear, and always with an obstetrician in there, sort of like the head of MFM,
Mm-hmm.
and just really sort of like overbearing. And I was trying so hard to sort of maintain this spiritual connection to my baby, but it was really hard because all this like technology and everything was really
Mm.
overtaking, and all
Yeah.
these opinions and that sort of thing. So we told people that I was pregnant, but didn't tell anybody about the omphalocele, because I didn't want people again projecting their fear, however what
Mm-hmm.
well-meaning, about
Mm-hmm.
what does
Yeah.
that mean on me. So we just really kept that to ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
but let our families know, our immediate families,
Yeah.
so that we had their support. So it was this, yeah, really over surveilled pregnancy. Just yeah, that wasn't very enjoyable, but I maintained that connection through daily meditation practices, and I
Mm-hmm.
was chanting all of the healing mantras that
Oh,
that I
yeah.
had to make, to give him that.
Yeah.
And also from that blood test, we found out he was a boy, which I knew anyway, but I
Mm-hmm.
was
Yeah,
able
that
to sort of
feeling.
like really, yeah, develop that connection.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so throughout the pregnancy, I said to them, I really want a natural vaginal birth. Like, natural birth, is that ever going to happen in a hospital with like maternal fetal medicine? No.
Mm-hmm.
But they said like, oh yeah, we're really supportive of that. But then as we started getting down towards, that like the third trimester, they started turning around and really sort of making their true colors known.
Yeah.
So I'd engaged a doula, because I guess that we weren't gonna, it was going to be a bit of a struggle to advocate for what I wanted. Um, and throughout the wanting to do certain testing like GBS and all that kind of thing, I declined. So I was already becoming this like problem patient for them, and
Yeah.
they were getting a bit annoyed, sort of the midwives I would have my appointments with, because I'm not sort of conforming. And I think because
Mm-hmm.
people there are high risk and their babies are deemed to be, sort of
High
at
risk
risk,
as
I think,
well. Yeah.
yeah, that they generally just expect people to follow along with what they say. But I was
Mm-hmm.
challenging things and asking lots of questions, which they really didn't like.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so then obviously the whole like nonsense of COVID started, and all the restrictions that they started putting in place at the hospitals with regards to like people at appointments. They then wouldn't allow me a support person to come. So my doula had been to a couple of appointments with me. And
Mm-hmm.
she'd, prompted me or spoken up a couple of times, which they really didn't like. I don't know. I don't think many people birth with
Mm-hmm.
MFM with a doula.
Okay.
Um, so it was immediate, like she can't come, and then my partner couldn't come. So I was going into all these appointments by myself, and I
Oh,
was being told like, yeah, like you're gonna. And at this point, like ultrasounds were down to 2 weeks, every 2 weeks, and it was just sort of like, okay, well, you're going to be allowed this amount of time in stage one, this amount of time in stage two, and there'll be, it was never sort of like there's the option of this. Is there will be continual fetal monitoring, and there will
right.
be this, and
Mm-hmm.
talk of forceps and vacuums and all that kind of thing. And it was just like, oh,
Mm. That's
I just
crazy to me. That's so crazy.
can't, can't handle this.
Ugh.
Um, and throughout the pregnancy, they'd done extra testing, like, sort of an echocardiogram and all these sorts of things. And I kept asking, okay, well, how bad is it? How big is this?
Mm-hmm.
And how long is my baby going to need to be in hospital? Because he needed, surgery to repair.
Mm-hmm.
But every time it was like, oh, I don't know, like, oh, we'll only really be able to tell at birth. And then we had like one of the best, well, probably the best pediatric surgeon lined up. And then they started, as we were getting closer and closer, to start to um, coerce and really threaten me that, oh, if you go into labor naturally and that doctor isn't available, you're just going to get whichever other doctor is there. So I already knew that we were getting the best surgeon to do his surgery.
Right.
But it was sort of like, oh, you run the risk of him not being available and you're just getting like whichever other doctors are there, which aren't as good. So if this was all to push me into a C-section because that's what they want to schedule it in, it's easier for them. And ultimately I decided that it would be a better option for me to go ahead with that planned C-section rather than wait and go into spontaneous labor and then have, everything coming at me with the monitoring. And I knew then that it would end up being traumatic. So to me, that seemed like the better option, especially when it came to like not being allowed to have a doula in for my birth and all of that kind of thing. So I knew my partner wouldn't be able to advocate for me in that way. So ended up scheduling that C-section in. So went in at 39 weeks. It was all really weird, just walking up to the hospital, pulling my little suitcase along.
And it's
Just
really,
not.
can I just make note, like that's really sad that you got so backed into a corner that, you felt as though the only option to save yourself from greater trauma in your birth was to go in for a scheduled C-section. Like that's so crazy to me that that is the medical system that women are bringing their children into, that they get so backed into a corner that the thought process is to save myself from great amount of trauma because my partner won't be able to be in the hospital with me, my doula, my support system won't be able, like it's just going to be me, so I'm just going to have to like do what they say and let them cut me open, or else you're going to be like so traumatized if you try and have a vaginal birth. Like that, it just blows my mind. I'm so like, wow, I can't believe that that is the start of your motherhood journey. You haven't even finished your story and it's like already at this point, and I'm just like, what is going on? This is crazy.
It is, but all by design, it works perfectly for them. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, it's exactly how it's meant to be in the medical system. But sorry, continue on with your
oh, no,
story.
no, 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 that's fine. So went in, had the C-section. He was immediately taken off for them to, go and wrap him, measure him, weigh him, all of that sort of thing. Wasn't given the option of skin to skin. And then he was then taken into the special care nursery. So my partner stayed with him the whole time. And then I went off to recovery, and it was just gut-wrenching. Like I just cried the entire time. So
did you even get to see him at all, or did
they wheeled him over like the resuscitator before they took him out, and I kind of was able to just about touch his hand from where I was whilst they were still stitching me up.
That's heartbreaking.
And then we got, like they took photos of us, but then he was taken off. So throughout recovery, like midwife came and expressed colostrum from me, but it just like it was this real out of body experience. I just didn't feel like I was actually there. It was just I just wanted my baby. And then they took me from their recovery. They wanted to take me straight up to the ward, and I said no, I have to see my baby. I'm not going there without. So they wheeled me on my bed, like trying to get me past all of the little bassinets in there, but got me next to him, so I was able to have like half an hour with him. But he was all attached, like he had IVs going in everywhere. He had sort of like the breathing sort of scuba snorkel thing on, and because he had breathing difficulties. But I mean, it's no real surprise when he's ripped from my womb and then not put on my chest, and he wasn't able to regulate his so he did need help with breathing, but it's so they don't, it's not really important to them because they've got the machines to yeah, to do it. So we had that time, and then they took me off to the ward, but they
Mm,
had me in a shared room
mm,
with a woman who had her baby. So I'm there in the bed with the curtain drawn, and all I can hear is this woman and her husband and their baby,
oh,
next to me in the same room. And, my body, because I didn't have my baby there, it's like
mm,
my body would have been thinking that my baby was dead,
yeah.
basically.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was just gut wrenching. And I just sat and cried and cried and cried throughout the whole thing. And it was just awful. So I kept
Oh,
buzzing and just saying, like, you have to move me. I would rather be out in the hallway than in
yeah.
this room with these
Mm-hmm.
people. And like, they were so these people, like, they didn't know how to, they would try to put a nappy on backwards. They had these baby clothes that they'd just gotten, straight from the shop and hadn't washed and all this sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And I could just hear like these
Yeah.
really unconscious people, like, how did they have their baby? And I'm the one that's done all this preparation
Mm-hmm.
and I'm so ready, but I don't have my baby with me.
Mm,
So I finally get moved to my own room, and later that night, he had then been moved from special care to the ICU at the Children's Hospital.
okay.
So the Children's ICU. Unbeknownst to me, upon his transfer there, the handover was quite chaotic. My partner said he didn't have a good feeling about it when everything was happening. There were too many people talking over one another, and it just didn't seem like a really smooth transition. And then when they hooked him up to you know the pumps and the drips and everything, because they needed to sedate him because he was having surgery the next day,
Mm-hmm.
um, and he was being sedated with midazolam.
Mm.
Now, I don't know if you know much about that and how that's been used in the last couple of years, but
No.
it's like it's the strongest member of the what's
Is
it
it an opiate?
Valium family.
Oh,
Yeah, so
Valium. Okay.
so it's just, yeah, so it's kind of like the strongest one. So when they're intubating babies, it's or anybody really, because they're going to shove tubes down their throat, they need them to be completely sedated.
Mm.
um, that's actually been used on old people, like in the last couple of years, to sedate them, and then blame their cause of death on something else that came about, so in recent
Um,
years. So it's a pretty strong,
mm.
yeah, pretty strong medication.
Mm.
And because somebody input like they had to dilute this amount into some sort of inert, sort of thing to then be put through to him,
Mm.
they missed a decimal point, and what he was supposed to get over an 8-hour period, he got in one go. So they overdosed him
Oh my
immediately,
gosh.
and then his heart rate dropped. So like they almost killed my
Oh
baby
my
because somebody's
God.
not paying attention to what they're doing properly. So
Yeah.
then had to work, like, obviously alarms started going off, and they then had to work and give him adrenaline and noradrenaline constantly to
Oh,
then bring
poor
his heart rate
baby.
back up. So, and this took, like, it took them 2 days to stabilize him properly and get his heart rate back up to the point where he would be able to have that surgery. So, but the hospital, the head of that children's ICU spoke to my partner, but then he went off shift and was away because it was Easter, it was a long weekend, so
Mm.
he wasn't back in. And then the nursing unit manager came in, and we were never allowed to be spoken to at the same time because of all the
Mm.
restrictions. Only one parent could be in the ICU at a time, and the other person had to
Mm.
be outside. So it was never really addressed as to what went on. But like my focus was just him and making sure that he is going to be better.
Yeah, of
um, so
course.
yeah, I finally got to hold him when he was 3 days old. Well, it was
Mm.
on his third day, so I hadn't actually held my baby. I'd only been able to be by his bedside and just touch him. But he
Oh.
was so connected up to everything. It was just, yeah,
Mm.
it wasn't possible. So I held him. He went in for surgery. They were able to, pretty easily push his organs back in and stitch him up. They didn't
Mm.
get full closure, so we knew that he was going to have another surgery at a later time. But his
Okay.
surgeon said when he's bigger and he's just more able, like from sort of 12 months on, it would be a
Okay.
good time to
Okay.
um, to do that.
Mm.
So he then got transferred back to special care at the women's hospital. And I was still there. So I really milked my stay. Like I stayed for 6 days because I wanted to be in the same building. Because when he was in special care, they don't provide beds there. It's just a chair, basically. So, and they really encourage parents to go home, you know, of an evening. Like, come and spend all day sitting by your, you know, child's bedside, but when it's bedtime, you know, go home and leave them alone. And that just to me wasn't so then the midwives then started sort of hassling me to get me out of the room because they obviously needed it for somebody else, and they can only bill, you know, a maximum of so many days, you know, sort of on Medicare. So they didn't want me in that room anymore. And it was just like, oh, for your mental health, it's going to be better for you. And challenge one, I was just like, excuse me, better for my mental health. But have you ever had a baby, full stop? Have you had a baby, go into special care, and then the prospect of you being separated from them because you're not allowed to stay in the same hospital anymore, sort of thing. But they got me out. And then, so he'd been in there, like it's been a week then. From birth, and he was progressing really well, and like he went from sort of the high level down to the mid level, and then like they started to need to monitor him less and less because his breathing was fine. He was a you know, a healthy full-term baby. It was just the fact that he'd had, you know, these organs on the outside which then had to be put back in. So when his monitoring sort of became less and less, I sort of questioned, like, does he need to be in this mid-level care? Because you're not monitoring this anymore, you're not monitoring that. And it was just, oh, we'll decide when he needs to move down. Like, they really don't like suggestions coming from the parents as to, you know, whether we need to sort of keep, but ultimately it'll come down to money because they'll be able to bill for a greater, you know, amount if they're in a higher level of care.
Totally.
So then managed to get him moved down into the low level of care. I had started breastfeeding him when he was a week old, because before then he was being fed through a nasogastric tube. But it had always been my my colostrum and my milk that I'd been pumping around the clock. And then their rule was kind of like once your child has done a full 24 hours of suck feeding, and that's whether, to them, they don't care whether that's breast or bottle, but for me it was really important that it was breast. And I'd done some breastfeeding education in pregnancy, and I'd had you know, like a call with a woman that I trust very much, so sort of in those early days. So I knew what I needed to do in order to get that you know, that breastfeeding off to a successful start. But the hospital lactation consultant had come in, who was hopeless. Like, I don't even know how that woman has a job. But, you know, had come in and said, these babies don't have instincts. And it was just like, well, of course all babies have instincts, but apparently because they're in special care, that just wipes all of that, you know, apart. And she would just have really conflicting information. It was just kind of, and then the special care nurses would all come in with, and, you know, throw in their 2 cents worth, and it was all just leave me alone, let me just do this. So it got to sort of like, we were approaching the 2-week mark since his birth, and it was just seemingly really hard. Like, they wanted to keep him in there for longer, even though they weren't really monitoring much. So I had a conversation with Dr. Robin, and she was just sort of like, it's a hospital, it's not prison. Like, you just leave and you take your baby when you want to. So I went in that day, and I'd had to go home because they wouldn't. I'd asked for a bed because they had rooms for parents that came from like a great distance, but they wouldn't let me sleep in it. So I'd stayed there until like 11 o'clock at night, and then went home for a few hours sleep, and then was back again at like 5 o'clock in the morning. So he would have only had one feed in between then, which they gave him a bottle for, which I was so dead against, but was straight back that next morning, and then back on the breast. So then we'd done a full 24 hours of suck feeds. So when the doctors came to do their rounds that morning, I just told them, look, I'm going home with my baby today. Get whatever paperwork you need to. And they're like, oh, this isn't, oh, we haven't decided this. And it's just sort of like, I don't really care. Just, we're leaving. We're going today. So they tried to like drag everything out and, oh, we need to get this referral to this person. You need to, have a pediatrician that you're going to follow up with, all of that kind of thing. But
Mm-hmm.
finally that afternoon, they were like, okay, like you can go. So we went home, but I don't know, my start to motherhood, I was just filled with all this uncertainty. I
Yeah.
definitely, looking back on it, had, postpartum anxiety because of
Mm-hmm.
all this. It was just so not the start that I wished I had gotten. And
Mm-hmm.
he'd lost more than 10% of his birth weight, but he'd had fluid pumped through him when I was having my C-section. So was that ever his true weight anyway, kind of thing. But
Yeah.
this was all pushed and made to, seem like a really serious event. And this is a problem. And, we need to monitor this. So I went to an appointment about a week later with a pediatrician rather than just a GP who you would normally see here. In Australia, and she again was just sort of like, oh, he's not regaining weight quick enough, this is just terrible, you're going to have to start supplementing him.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just give him formula, that's easier. And I said, well, no, that's not going to happen, like I'm breastfeeding my child, so like I'm going to make this work. And she came out with this nonsensical, like, just breastfeed him for 5 minutes so he's got the benefit for it, and then top him up with formula afterwards. And I was just sort of
Oh my
like,
gosh. Yeah.
clearly you've not breastfed, like I'm not even listening to you. So I walked out of that appointment and
Yeah.
they asked me if I wanted to rebook. Not a chance.
Mm-hmm.
um so that, yeah, this start was, there was always this doubt being like cast upon me, like, is your milk supply enough, like, that there must be something wrong, he's slow to gain weight, there's this. But he'd been through major surgery, so he's probably not going to gain weight like your average baby. And
Yeah.
I'm a small person, my partner's quite small, like we're probably going to be on the lower end of the,
Mm-hmm.
the percentiles on those stupid charts. But there was
Yeah.
just all this, yeah, I was always made to think that there was something wrong. So it really took me a few months to find my feet in motherhood, and sort of really shut out the rest of the noise. So I think we were like 2.5 months in, and I'd been triple feeding. So I was, I'm like breastfeeding him straight away, pumping afterwards, and then topping him up with, sort of like syringes, spoons, bottles of express milk, all of this kind of thing. And it was burning me out because I was just on
Mm-hmm.
this constant, as soon as I'd finished that, then it would be time to feed him again. So I was
Right.
just either, attached to this pump or, with him. And it was just really quite difficult. And then, yeah, like 2.5 months in, I just went, no. Oh, and I think I'd even done the supply line as well. So,
Okay.
yeah. And I just thought, no, like, this is not how it's going to go down, because it's not sustainable. It's driving me mad. I'm just not enjoying this. So I stopped all of the expressing and just went to exclusive breastfeeding. And it was such a relief when I
Mm.
did. And it was just, and from there on in, I just really, I just shut out all of the
Mm.
information. So I was still going and getting him weighed just at like our local GPs. And the nurse there would always be like, oh, he's approaching 4 months now, you've got to start giving him some sweet potato. I'm like, okay,
What?
so like, what evidence are you basing this on, and what like nutritionally does sweet potato have that's like superior to breast milk? I'm not
Right.
quite sure, and she could never give me this information. But it's just all these people like projecting their
Mm-hmm.
outdated, opinions on sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I just really felt like I don't need to listen to these people, because they don't know what they're talking about. Like, they really are just so off course.
Mm-hmm.
um this is just not how it's meant to be. So I feel like I really sort of like got into my groove by the time he was, sort of 5-6 months, and I had shut out all of that, outside pressure. And I
Mm-hmm.
stopped going in and getting him weighed, and it was just sort of like, he's just him, he's fine. I can recognize if he's, if he was really sick, I would then take him to go and see somebody, but otherwise I'm just going to trust in myself and my instincts and him.
Yeah.
So fast forward, I then start like doing more research, and I start questioning like the safety of ultrasounds based on, information that I've found, and started wondering, like, was it even the early dating scan that had maybe caused some damage and,
Ah.
contributed to his
Mm-hmm.
omphalocele. And then, sort of free birth sort of started coming up on my radar, and,
Okay.
sort of on Instagram and following accounts and listening to a couple of podcasts and really, you know, sort of like going against the sort of the normal grain and, you know, questioning, why does my child need like vaccinations? Like what is this all about? So I really started like leaning into doing things in a more instinctive and natural way. And, you know, the half of the girls in my mum's group would all be talking about sleep training and all of that. And it just seemed so foreign to me. It was just like, this isn't how it's meant to be. This is just not the way.
Yeah.
And I knew at this point I was going to have another baby, but there was no way that I was going to, you know, sort of go down that same route and follow that medical, sort of model again, because I can see how flawed it is and how wrong it was for my first. So there was just no way I was doing that again. And then sort of like fast forward to like 15 months in, and I then started getting those messages again, like, you know what, it's time. So, and I, you know, getting those messages from my spirit baby. I still hadn't had my cycle return at that point. So it was just a bit of sort of like, have I got some kind of like imbalance? Is there something, like, I started thinking, is there something wrong with like my thyroid? So I got all these blood tests, but it turned out that my prolactin levels were too high because like of his breastfeeding. So because he just would have really long sessions. He'd had a tongue tie and a lip tie, which had been revised by laser, but they'd started to reattach again. But I just think like he'd feed for a really, really, really long time. And that was keeping those levels really high. So I then decided I needed to change something so I could get my cycle return. So at that point, I dropped his like midday after lunch feed to sleep. Sort of feed. So that there was a longer period of time in between feeds. So I would feed him in the morning when he woke up, and then again in the evening, and then as much as he wanted over, like throughout the night. But it was just sort of like getting rid of that daytime feed, then have my cycle return. So at this point, I was just sort of like, dating scans are not even going to happen. So I will know when I'm conceiving this baby. Like, it was all very planned. I was taking my basal body temperature every morning. I was checking my cervical, fluid just to make sure. And I had one cycle, and then on the second one, I was just sort of like, okay, this is the day. Okay, so my partner's like, oh, okay, like I'm being told. It's just sort of like, so I know exactly when she was conceived, and it was just, I feel like I almost felt it that night.
I've heard that a lot of times from women, that they know the exact, not even the exact day, but like the moment it happens.
Yes, it feels very, very much like that. So I knew I was pregnant. I knew straight away that I started to get these feelings immediately. Like, I was put off breakfast, and I love eating breakfast, I really do. But 2 days in, I couldn't stomach eating breakfast. So at this point, we had decided that we were moving states, and I knew that there was going to be like that early period. I was going to be moving from one state to another. So I felt the pull. I hadn't decided to free birth, but something said to me, like, just go and get some like proof of this pregnancy early on, just in case you need it, sort of like later on, because there's no way I was going to be getting any scans done at all this time around. So I went to that GP and just got, like my HCG sort of tested, which confirmed obviously a pregnancy that I knew I already was, and roughly how far along it was. And then I never saw her again. So, and then we moved states, and we had to go into quarantine for a couple of weeks, moving up here in a hotel. And I started researching private midwives up here. And I felt really called to work with somebody of color. So I was looking for, midwives. I didn't just want that kind of like, oh yeah, we're like an MGP that come to your house kind of thing, like still a hospital.
What state did you move to from?
Oh, so I moved from New South Wales to Queensland.
Okay.
yeah, so I'm sitting in hotel quarantine, and I'm checking out all these details of private midwives, and then two came to mind. So there's an Indigenous Australian woman,
Mhm.
and then another from New Zealand, and I felt that it would be one of these women would be better placed for me,
Mhm.
because I just felt like I needed somebody of color to work with me.
Mhm.
Um, so I contacted them, and I was like texting one, and I was very clear with her about the coercion that I had experienced in the hospital with my first pregnancy, and everything that had occurred. And I think I'd mentioned in one of the texts I was really enjoying this wild pregnancy so far, because it was pretty wild, with the exception of one blood test. I
Mhm.
knew that
Yes.
I wasn't doing anything else. And then I think as soon as I sent that message, she just ghosted me and then didn't respond.
Really?
And I'm like, yeah. So,
Whoa.
and I was kind of like waiting for this response. Like, 1 day, 2 days went by, and then over a week later, she then
Mhm.
contacted me and was just sort of like, "Oh, sorry, I booked my last birth for July. I don't have any more space." It was
Wow.
just kind of like, oh, all right. And then the other midwife, who I later came to realize that they are actually each other's backup.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
she was like, "Sorry, I'm on holiday in July. I can't help you." Um, it was just like, okay. So I've been
Wow.
rejected by these two women, and but I sat with it, and I just thought, like, what is this telling me? What's
Mhm.
the universe telling me right now?
Mhm.
It's that these women aren't able to offer what I want from them, and that is a truly undisturbed birth, a physiological
Exactly.
birth. Because
Mhm.
even though they're private midwives, they've got all their,
Mhm.
checklists and rules that they have to follow, so the APRA don't, come down on them when they audit
Yeah.
things. So it
Mhm.
was a real blessing that
Absolutely.
yeah. So free birth was definitely like, I'd been listening to some more stories and reading more stuff, and I was just sort of
Mhm.
like, okay, this is what I'm doing. So I will find a doula, but only somebody that is really, sort of supportive and experienced in free births, because I don't want sort of, your run of the mill
Yeah.
kind of doula
Like
that
a
is in the
mainstream
hospital all the
doula.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I found Kelly, and oh, she's amazing. She's become such a great friend, earth
Mhm.
auntie, and yeah, she was just wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, so throughout the whole, pregnancy, I felt so cared for, but
Mhm.
so empowered at the same time. Like, never once did I feel that she was, you know, telling me what to do. This was my journey.
Mhm.
And I was just loving it. And,
Yeah.
friends would ask, like, "Oh, when's your due date? When are you having scans?" And I'd respond to them like, "I'm not.
Mhm.
I'm pregnant. I'll be having my baby in winter." And they were like, "What's, due date?" And I was like, "Well, probably July." Um, and people thought I was mad, like, but
Yeah.
like, don't don't you want to go and just like check to see that everything's okay? And it was like, well, what? I could go in for a scan, but what's that going to tell me? It's going to tell me
Mhm.
like that moment in time what's happening, but it's not going to tell me what's happening 4 hours later, 4 days later, 4 weeks later. It's just,
Mhm.
and I developed this really great connection with her already. Like, I started feeling her move. I think it was just around Christmas time. So I would have been about 12 weeks, 13 weeks pregnant. I could already feel the movement, which is pretty early, like,
Mhm.
or around, probably around the 12
Mhm.
weeks. And I think it was after Christmas lunch. And I thought, no, this is not indigestion just because I ate too much.
Mhm.
This is my baby moving around. And
Mhm.
I was like communicating with her. She was guiding me and telling me what she needed from me. So
Wow.
there was just no need for tests or like to go and
Yeah.
see anybody. I don't need to go and have a look at an image of my baby,
No. And that's how
on a
it's meant.
screen.
Yeah, and that's how it's meant to be. You're so tapped in and tuned into your body and your baby that she just gives you the guidance. You can ask a question, you can feel the feeling, and that's what's so beautiful about having a pregnancy outside of the system, doing it completely wild, is you get to, as you said, feel empowered about what's going on and in control. And it's not taking you outside of yourself to like have someone tell you, oh yeah, your baby is fine. Come back in 4 weeks and we'll tell you again your baby's fine. It's like you can just close your eyes and say, "Baby, how are you? How are you doing today? Let mommy know." And they'll tell you. They'll give you the straight
Yes,
answer. That's so beautiful.
yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that was really it. And she was like really giving me very clear messages and
Mhm.
like what I needed to heal
Mhm.
um before she came through. Like it was really
Wow.
very clear to me. So I did some family constellations work.
Mhm.
My parents came over whilst I was pregnant. So they were here in like April, and I was, yeah, and she was born in July. So I did a lot of work with them as well in just
Mhm.
healing, yeah, healing some trauma, the wounds
Mhm.
from both of those parents, so that then I wasn't passing that on to her.
Yeah.
And it just felt so freeing and relieving to know that, that kind of stops there. And there's obviously more work to do. There's always, you never stop
Mhm.
doing the work, but I
Yeah.
just felt like I was giving her the best,
Mhm.
sort of yeah, the best start. And when I visualized my birth, I always kept seeing that I was going to have her at dawn, just as the sun was coming up.
Yeah.
So this image just kept coming to me in my dreams every time I sat down and really felt into what was going to happen. And I was on
Mhm.
the phone to my sister and we we're having this conversation and I let her know. And she said, "Oh, that's so funny. I had a dream about her like blazing through the sky in a chariot and lighting up the sky from dark to light."
Wow.
So the Roman goddess of dawn is Aurora.
Okay.
And after I had that conversation with my sister, I started like I'm just sort of like dawn, like goddess
Mhm.
blazing through the sky. So then I've started to get all of this information that's Aurora. And I was just sort of
Mm.
like, oh, thank you. Thank you. You've told us your
Mm.
name. You've sent us that message to
Yeah.
let us know what your name is. And I didn't say anything to anybody from there, not even my sister, but I knew then that
Mhm.
that was her name. That was
Yeah.
not that I was choosing that as her name, but that's her name.
Yep. She
Um,
told it to you. Oh, that's so beautiful.
yeah. And unbeknownst to me, and my mum tells me this like after she was born, when she came to visit, like when my parents and sister came to visit when she was like 7 weeks old,
Mm.
my mum then turned around to me and said, "Oh, whilst you were pregnant, I kept dreaming about the northern lights dancing in the sky,
Wow.
which are the aurora borealis." So she'd
Uh-huh.
literally communicated to all of us, but my
Oh,
mum
that
had
just
just
gave
never
me
told me.
chills. Whoa, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. In sending this message, so I was just sort of like, oh, it's so divine,
Yeah.
like that she did that,
Yeah.
and it
Oh,
just shows that
wow.
connection.
Mm.
So yeah, that was wonderful.
Hmm.
So
Can I
getting towards the
quickly,
end, oh
sorry, can I quickly ask, because you had now made that decision to have the wild pregnancy and go on for
yes,
the free birth, how was your husband in this decision? Was
um,
he okay with it? Did he want more information or like, yeah, what was that like kind of bringing it up?
I didn't really, I didn't ask him. I just told him that
Yeah.
that was what was happening.
Mhm.
And he knows when to not challenge me. He's just sort of
Okay.
like, okay,
Yeah.
that's what we're doing then. That's if
Nice.
that's what you've
Okay.
decided.
Yeah.
All right. He had complete faith in me
Perfect.
um, that I would be able to do that. I think he's still scared, but he wouldn't dare say that to me or
Mm.
suggest like, but shouldn't we? No, there was
Mm.
no, yeah. So he was just like,
Okay.
okay, that's what we're doing. And
Yeah.
having our doula, like she was so great there in providing that support for him emotionally
Mhm.
and holding space for him that he then
Mhm.
felt quite comfortable in
Okay.
knowing that it's not just going to be like me and him and I kind of
Right.
thing. Because I
Okay.
think that
Yeah.
would have like really stressed him out.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so those last few weeks, I had gone back to work part time in like the 6 months from when we moved up to Queensland. So it was back like my old company doing the same job, but just in a different location.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so I my son went to daycare um, for like 3 days a week for
Mhm.
that period of time, which felt really weird because he'd been with me the whole time until he was almost 2.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but then he'd gone to daycare for that, so I could return to work. I just wanted to save up some money because I knew that I wasn't going to be going back to work again. Like
Mhm.
it's not like I'd be taking a maternity leave and then returning. I was just sort of
Mhm.
like, that's me done with traditional work now.
Yeah.
I'm going to be doing my own thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I finished up at the end of June. I'd only been working from home in those last 2 weeks anyway, because I just was huge and couldn't get in and out of my car. Um, and it was just getting quite a struggle. So so on the days where he was at daycare, like he was then dropped down to 2 days, I'd just be like floating around the house and painting birth affirmations and, like gathering all this stuff and preparing my altar and just really tuning in and, making all this delicious food because I wanted the freezer all stocked and really planning for my postpartum, which I hadn't done the first time. It kind of like took me by shock that first time. So I wanted this, everything really like beautifully supportive of me in that time. So I got another checked out like a food ordering service specifically for postpartum. So got all of that lined up and was just really enjoying that last couple of weeks of pregnancy. And then I woke up this Sunday and I felt like I thought I was still going to be pregnant for another week or two because I was only just approaching, I was just on like 40 weeks if you follow like the medical way of calculating things, or 38 weeks from conception. And it was just on there or just past there. And I just felt like I had to go down to the water and get some photos of my bump. Like she was just telling me like, do it, mum. Like you need to get down there. So we went down and got these beautiful photos and just basked in the sun. It was a winter day, but it was really sunny and it just felt so nice. And then went home the next day. I then felt like I had to do all this baking. So I made all these different things, and it got towards the evening. I started to make a quiche, which is just like something I never do. Like I don't do pastry, but I just felt really called to. I've been in the kitchen all day long. And then I'm like trying to line this tin with pastry, and then I could just start feeling like, these surges. And I'm sort of bracing myself on, but it wasn't like full surge. It was really sort of early labor. So I got like halfway through this quiche and then just abandoned it. I'm just like, I have to go to bed. So my partner put my son to sleep that night, which like he never does. I've always fed him to sleep, sort of every night since he was born. But I needed to go and rest. And then in the middle of that night, I just got woken by a huge, huge surge. And it sort of really took my breath away and then like jolted me awake. And it was just like, wow, okay. Went back to sleep and then it happened again. I don't know how much later, but a little bit later. And I needed to go to the toilet. So I sat down and still in like trying to wake myself up. Then my waters released because there was just this like, I knew it wasn't like a wee because I've never felt anything with that kind of pressure before. And I was just sort of like, oh my gosh, this is happening. Like I was not expecting this. Surely she's meant to like wait another week or so, but this is happening. So went back to bed and just thought like I need to sleep, I need to rest, conserve my energy. But then I just kept getting woken up. So it got to like 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'd already like kicked my partner out into a separate room a couple of months before because of all of my pillows and just needing like to be comfortable in my bed with, needing all that extra space. So I went into his room and I was like, it's happening. You can't go to work, by the way, because you need to look after our son. Like I'm not going to be able to do that in this state. So all day, I just kept getting hit by these pretty strong surges, but they didn't ever seem to gain any kind of pattern or regularity or get closer together. So, I'd go down to sort of like maybe 6 minutes in between, and then they would blow back out to, like 10 to 15 minutes. in
Mm-hmm.
between. So it's just kind of like, oh, goodness knows how long this is going to go on for.
Yeah.
My doula was at a birth that day, and she'd actually had like a run of births like in a very short time frame. So it like she was like going from one to the next to the next, and she was
Mm,
with another woman, but it didn't seem like anything was actually going to sort
mm,
of happen. Now, partway through that day, I like where the way that she had moved, she was pressing on my bladder and I
mm,
couldn't empty my bladder at all. Like everything I tried, all the peppermint oil in the world was
mm,
not helping me to release that. I was like in the shower, sitting in a warm bath, like
mm,
nothing. And that I knew that she was stopping me from being able to empty my bladder, but I couldn't empty my bladder because like it was, you know, the two of them were affecting one another.
yeah.
And then I'd mentioned to my partner about having not being like her, not feeling her as I had before.
Mm.
And then in his mind, he then started getting super worried
Okay.
um, about something going wrong.
Mm.
But then all I was thinking about is like, I really need to do a wee, but I
Yeah.
can't. And what am I going to do? And it's
Yeah.
been like 8 hours now since I have. So late at night, I was just sort of like, look, I need some help with this. Like, how about we go to the hospital? And I'd heard on a podcast, another free birth one, about this woman that had gone to hospital to get a catheter. And I was like, that's a great idea. How
Mm,
about we just go to hospital and I can go and get a catheter? And he was like, yeah, we need to go and find out what's going on, if there's something wrong. So like
mm,
2 o'clock in the morning, get my son out of bed, load him into the car in the like dead of the night, freezing cold night,
mm,
drive to this local hospital. And like my surges are probably about 6 minutes in between, but they're like really strong at this
mm,
point. So um, they admit me like over to the maternity ward. All of the doctors are in surgery doing an
mm,
emergency C-section.
mm,
Um, so I just get put into this room with a midwife, and I just said, look, I really I need a catheter. I need to sort of do this. And she's like, oh, well, we really need to like monitor and just see what's going on. So she straps the belt around me, um, and yeah, and then wants to start monitoring. She's like got me laid down on a bed, and I'm just sort of like, no, I need to sit up, like I need to sort of move around. And she's there saying,
mm,
oh, I really need you to be still because we don't get a good reading if you're not very still. But I'm as like close to sitting up as I can. Um, and I'm attached to this thing for like 15 minutes. And during that time, I think I had 3 surgeries. It was like somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes.
mm,
And she'd said to me on arrival, like, oh, like who you've not been to this hospital before, like who are you doing your care through? And I'd said, oh, I've got a private midwife, but she's at another birth right now, and that's
mm.
why she couldn't get to me. And it was just really important that I get this, like be able to empty my bladder. And she
Yeah.
wanted the name of the midwife, so I just off the top of my head gave her the name of one of these women that had like said no to me months before,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
and picked the one that was like from the north side of the city, so that she
Mm,
didn't like there was a chance that she wouldn't know who she was. So
mm-hmm.
she's like writing all this down in the
Mm-hmm.
notes, and then she's just sort of like, oh, I could offer you a vaginal exam, but I think the look on my face as soon as she said it, she corrected herself and she was like, but you'd probably decline that. And I was like, yes, decline, like just
Mm-hmm.
hurry up. So worked out that there's absolutely nothing wrong with my baby. She's fine. Like the readings, but she wanted to still keep me connected to this. And I was like, no, it's really uncomfortable. Like I need to move about, get it off, get it off.
Mm-hmm.
She was like, okay, but the doctors need to come and see you. And I was like, you know what, can we just sort out my bladder, please? Like, can I get that catheter? So
Mm-hmm.
she did this like really quick. I was expecting like full on catheter like I'd had with my C-section, but it was just this like bag. And she kind of just did this like pop and immediately drained it. And I was just sort of like, oh, wow, this is just, oh, that's great. I feel good again.
Yeah.
And then my next surge
Right.
came along, but it was actually like, it was a bit more manageable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so then in my mind, I was just sort of like, okay, well, I've got all I needed from you.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, so I need to go now. And she's like, what? And she's like, I need to go home. And she's like, but don't you want to stay? And then my partner turns around and he was like, yeah, don't you want to stay? And I was like, shut up. shut up, like
zip it.
say anything else. And then she's just sort of like, and I'm like, no, I'm going to go home, and it's fine. My midwife will be with me in a few hours, and then I'll meet my baby tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And she's just like, what's going on? So she goes off and she's like, it's against my medical advice. Goes and gets these forms that she makes me then sign. And then the hospital porter comes back and like I get on the wheelchair and he wheels me past the midwife's station, and they're all like, what? Like, bye. And I'm like, see you, thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye. And off we go back to the car. So I'm like writhing around in the car seat again, until we get home and I'm able to like get more comfortable. And then things started to get a little bit closer together. And I said to my partner, okay, it's time to like blow up that pool and get it filled. So then late morning, I'm sort of like floating around in there, and it felt great. But then my surges started to get really spaced out again. I thought, oh, is this slowing things down? Like I've heard about this before, that the water can slow down labors. So I should really get out of here. And so this is like more than 24 hours in. This is like, we're probably like 30 hours into my labor at this point. And then my doula, it's late morning, so it's Wednesday. She gets there late morning because the traffic was really bad, and she comes with like the TENS machine, because until then I've just been clutching onto my little wooden comb, and that's all that I had been. That was my pain relief for like an entire day. And then hooked me up with the TENS, and that was just immediate relief, and it was great. Like I'd be pressing my button like constantly on this really, really high sort of speed. And then it felt really, really manageable. And then carried on laboring like that. The evening came and nothing had gotten close together again. Like I wasn't getting down to that pointy end. And she was like questioning, should she go home? But she lives like 45 minutes away from us. And something just said to her, like, no, I should stay. So we got the spare room set up for her. And like we've been trying to watch this documentary about this 90-year-old Mexican midwife who like goes around the village and is this really wonderful traditional midwife, and I'm kind of like half looking at the TV, but then I'm on all fours and I'm like grunting and making all these noises. And before my son had gone to bed, like he was like putting all this pressure on my lower back for me, and like trying as a 2-year-old to do like hip squeezes, but then he'd gone off to bed. And then I'm like really tired, so decided to go to bed. She went to bed because she was knackered as well, like she'd been up all day from having done this birth been at this birth the day before. And then went upstairs, started to drift off to sleep, but I ran out of water. I needed some water, so I called down to my partner. I'm like, can you bring me some more water? So he comes up, gets my cup, and goes downstairs to fill that up. And then I just started to drift off to sleep again, and then I just got this massive jolt and thought, I need to go into a poo. So like I like run as sort of quickly as I can to the ensuite and sit down, and then I just felt this pressure, and I was like, oh no, that's not a poo, that's pressure in the wrong part. And then I just like felt down, and then I felt her head crowning. So it's like back to the toilet where it all started, when my waters had broke. And then I'm just thinking, gosh, I probably could have saved myself like a couple of days here if I just spent some more time on the toilet. Maybe it would have things would have progressed a bit quicker. So then I started shouting down to my partner. I'm like, it's a head, it's her head. And then he like races to the spare room, wakes up Kelly, and he's like, Kelly, it's the head, it's the head. And he went into full panic mode, and he's just like, what do I do? What do I do? And she's like really calmly setting up the tripod, getting everything ready so that we could film it all. And she's just giving him these little tasks like, okay, go and get some towels. And he's like, oh, like, what's going on? So at this point, the water in the pool had gotten cold, and we hadn't bothered topping it up with warm water because nothing seemed like it was going to happen. So they're frantically trying to get hot water into this birth pool, but it's just not heating up quick enough. Like the
Mm.
hose is over there and they're just like, it's still cold, it's still cold. And he's like,
Mm.
she's like, oh, boil a kettle. And, you know, it's like, and she's like, no, I don't think there's time. So I'm in the shower at this point, and the water is like really providing, like nice warm water is providing some relief. And
Mm-hmm.
then, yeah, that whole fetal ejection reflex just took over. And then
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of moving into a position that felt good for me. And it's just sort of like I started to squat, and then I went into a bit of a lunge. And
Okay.
then her head just literally half of her head was out.
Mm.
And then I kind of just adjusted a little bit more, and then her whole head was out. So we have to turn the shower off. It's just sort of like we don't want her getting a full shower, just, you know,
Mm.
straight away. And then, and just sort of like moving sort of further down, I ended up sort of sitting down, and we had all towels around me. And
Mm.
then, yeah, within from that moment that I'd sat on the toilet
Mm.
to when she was born, it was just over 15 minutes.
Wow.
And then she just came. So, you know, it's like 48 hours plus. I'm not sure exactly how many, but it was like, it's a bit over 48 hours. I just wish I'd looked at the clock the first surge that I
Mm-hmm.
had. And then she popped out. Like she
Wow.
literally in like three movements or
Mm-hmm.
three surges kind of thing. And she
Mm-hmm.
was just here. And it was just like, it was so surreal,
Oh my
but so
God.
amazing. And just pulling her up to my chest, and immediately, you know, she just
Mm-hmm.
let out a bit of a weird sort of gurgled cry.
Mm-hmm.
But then her breathing sounded a bit sort of odd. So I just instinctively felt like I just needed to sort of like suck
Mm-hmm.
sort of around her nostrils just to sort of clear things a
Yeah.
little bit. So just did a little bit of that. And then like I was just like a wild animal, just like licking
Mm.
her head
Oh,
and just holding her close,
yeah.
and just, yeah, breathing her in and smelling her. And
Mm-hmm.
it was so amazing having felt that, and like the polar opposite to how it had been with my son.
Absolutely.
um
Wow, that's so
yeah,
beautiful. Oh, and
yeah.
what
So
time of the day was that? Was that the
so
dawn?
this is like, yeah, no, so it was
Okay.
before dawn. It was just after midnight.
Okay.
So yeah, but it was just into the next day, and it was the full moon. So, and
Wow.
it was just sort of, and something had said to me earlier in my pregnancy, like, she's going to come on the full moon. And she
Mm.
did. So,
Oh,
like, the labor started on Monday night, but then she was born just in the very early parts of Thursday morning. So,
wow. That's
yeah,
so beautiful, Fiona.
yeah.
Oh.
So that was just, oh, it was like, I've just never felt anything like it, but it was so perfect and so empowering and so healing.
Mm-hmm.
It was just wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So made it over to over to bed, and had her there, and she immediately starts like looking for my breast, and started feeding really soon after. And like through all the struggles that I'd gone through with breastfeeding my
Mm-hmm.
son, and that, you know, being really interrupted, that start, for her to be able to just latch on
Mm-hmm.
and start feeding like that was just, it was like a dream. It really, really was.
Yeah.
um so yeah, it was really amazing, but I was exhausted because I'd had this really long labor. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I just wanted to rest. And
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, it's just kind of like, oh, her placenta's still in there. So it's just kind of like, all right, what do I do? So I try to get myself into a position, like laying her on the bed on
Mm-hmm.
all fours, you know, trying to find a comfortable way, but it just wasn't coming.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was just sort of like, oh, should I go back to the toilet? Because, you know, that's where everything happens for me.
Yeah.
Um, but then it didn't come out again. And it was just kind of like I was trying, but then I was just so exhausted. And then
Mm-hmm.
I just decided to just rest and just leave it. And it would, you know, it will come out. Like I thought, it's gonna come when it's ready.
Mm-hmm.
And then I fell asleep, and obviously she'd be up feeding, but it still wasn't releasing. So the next, like, or later that morning, um, like obviously the cord had gone completely white. She'd had all of her blood, but it still hadn't come out. And it was just sort of like every time the cord touched her, it was cold, and, you know, it was sort of like bothering her. So we made the decision to burn the cord at that point in time. So we had like a little cord burning ceremony whilst I'm holding on to her, and we've got the box sort of like propped and just towels all in between, because like it's still inside, and it wasn't like the longest cord, so it was just it was becoming a bit, restrictive,
Yeah.
still being attached. So yeah, we did the cord burning and like sang a little song for her. My son was there, and it was really beautiful. But this is like 10 o'clock in the morning after she'd been born,
Yeah.
just after midnight. And then yeah, just throughout that day, we just tried everything to try and get the placenta out, like all the homeopathics. We did a half-hearted attempt. Like I said to Kelly, like, do you want to do a fundal massage? So, but she didn't want to do a fundal massage, because we know that's not a massage. It's like really uncomfortable. So she's trying her best, but she doesn't want to hurt me. And I'm just sort of like, it's okay, press a bit harder, but like, it's just not coming out.
Okay.
And it was just sort of like, okay, every story I've heard, like people say a couple of hours, up to then is kind of normal. But if it goes longer than that, maybe there's a problem kind of thing. But we were monitoring my temperature, and I was fine. Like there were no signs of infection. I hadn't lost a lot of blood. That was just like really minimal. So it was just sort of like, I'm just going to have to trust that it's going to come out when it's ready. So then went to sleep that night, and the following morning, and Kelly had gone home by this point. The following morning still hadn't birthed that placenta. So we're like, good 24 hours plus after birth. And it was just sort of like, oh gosh, all right, what do I do here? So we've made a few calls just to some private midwives to see if somebody would come out to see me. And they were like, oh, no, you need to just present to the hospital. There was no way I was going to go back to that hospital that I had been to like before to get my catheter, because like, were they going to treat me well if I'm just like, oh, by the way, I just, went to free birth my baby and now I can't get my placenta out. Like, didn't have any confidence that they would treat me well. So there's a bigger maternity hospital. But again, I did not feel called to go there. I didn't want to take my baby anywhere near a hospital. I didn't want to, be separated. I didn't want people wanting to start looking and poking and prodding at her. Like, we were both fine. We were both really healthy. So Kelly had done a ring around like her doula friends and managed to get hold of a tincture. That somebody had some spare of. So she picked it up from her and then got in the car and then drove over. I think, oh no, my partner had to go and meet her because she had something on that morning. So he had to drive to go and see her and pick this up, and then brought it home. And I literally took that, and I think I double dosed like whatever the instructions had said. And then within 5 minutes, I just felt all of that pressure, like, oh, okay, it's time. So went back to the shower where she'd been born, and got my big bowl, and then got into the same position as that she'd been in when she was born. And it just flopped out like this big squid, in a heavy, great big, sort of thing. And it was so like, it wasn't all flat. It was all like, because it had been sitting there like in my birth canal, obviously, for a period of time, and it looked like a football. It was kind of like all this like big bunch of sausages or something. Like, it was just weird. This kind of started to fuse together kind of shape, and then like he takes it downstairs and he's like, oh, I don't know what to put it in. Like, oh, I can't stay in the bowl. I'm like, no, you need to put it in something that we can seal, like something airtight. And he's just like in this frantic, like, oh, I don't know. So he gets like my biggest glass dish that I love to like. That's what I would make lasagna in.
Oh yeah.
And he puts it in that and puts the lid on it in the fridge. And then because then he was then going to I think we were waiting for Kelly to come back and pick it up so that she could like encapsulate, because that was the plan, that she would encapsulate it. But then we decided that it had been too long, and we didn't think that was a good idea. So like when she got it out, she prepared, like she was getting ready to prepare it, but she just didn't feel quite right
Mm-hmm.
about it. Like maybe the smell. And we
Yeah.
just felt that it had been too long because it was like 36 hours after birth that I
Yeah.
finally, you know,
Wow. Yeah.
birthed that placenta. So
Mm.
she took the prints of it and all of that and then brought it back to us. So it's still sitting in my freezer,
Oh, wow.
like a year later. And
Uh-huh.
really, we want to bury it, but I just need to find the right place because we're not in our forever home here.
Okay.
And I'm
Yeah.
not going to, like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
bury it in the back garden, knowing that one day I won't be able to visit and she won't be able to visit it. Like, I want her to have connection to that
Mm-hmm.
area. So I just need to find somewhere. But yeah, I still like don't have a good dish for lasagna now because the placenta is in there and it's just like
Oh.
like our parents have come out and like I've sent my dad to the because it's like the spare freezer in the garage.
Okay, yeah.
I've sent my dad like, oh, can you get some meat out of the freezer? And he's like, is it this that's in the plastic bag? And I'm like, no, don't get
Not
that one
that
out,
one.
Dad, please. That's we're not eating that. It's that's the
Oh.
placenta. So
Oh.
we'll get round to that, but it's just trying to figure out when. And then I want to do a bit of a ceremony for her as well,
Yeah, of
in
course.
when we do return that to the earth and maybe
Mm-hmm.
plant a tree over it, but it
Mm-hmm.
can just stay in the freezer until till we work out where's the best place.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for that to happen. But yeah, it's
Wow.
yeah, that
That's
was
I think one of the longest placenta stories I've heard, up to 36 hours. I
it
think,
was
yeah.
long.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it came out.
Yeah,
So
it
I
came
would just
out and all
advise,
was well. So, I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
maybe just get your herbs, get your tinctures ready
Yeah.
beforehand, just in case. It's probably better to have them and not need
Mm,
them rather than need them and
and
then
not
be in
have
this like
them.
scramble to try and
Totally.
find them. So,
Yeah.
but it's fine. And there was no,
Mm,
I didn't have to then have this invasive someone shoving their hand up there to pull it out and
yeah.
kind of thing. Like all these things that I see of like obstetricians posting things on Instagram of like how placentas are removed, and it's just so like,
Yeah,
no, that
it's
is
really
not.
gross. It's
Oh,
so cringe
like
and just like that's so sad. Why are you reveling in the fact that you're completely disturbing this part of the birth process, you know?
yeah,
Ugh.
yeah. So yeah, it came out,
Mm-hmm.
and then yeah, everything from there was just like it was such a dream. Like my postpartum was polar opposites, like night and day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to that with my son, and I just felt so well rested. Like I stayed in bed,
Yeah.
um, had everything brought to me. Finally went down to like the sofa after probably like 4 or 5 days, and then would just lay
Mm-hmm.
on the sofa
Mm-hmm.
with her, and then sort of like my son, like breastfeeding was great
Mm-hmm.
when my milk really came in and I started to like feel quite engorged because she couldn't handle that much.
Okay.
Rather than reaching for like a pump to kind of take the pressure off, it was just like my son came over and then just got a drink, which he was
Yeah.
just living his best life then because
Mm-hmm.
throughout pregnancy I continued to feed him to sleep, but I'm
Okay.
pretty sure he'd just been like dry feeding towards
Okay. Yeah.
the
Towards the
end,
end.
like he wasn't getting anything. And then all of a sudden he's like, woohoo, the milk's back.
This is
So
great.
every time I then started feeding her, he's like, this side, can I get some milk? This side. So, and it's like kind of been like that ever since. He's
Aw.
just now like she's a year old and he's like 2 years and 3 months. Like in the last maybe 2 months, he's just backed off and he's
Mm.
happy to just go back to feeding to sleep at night. But otherwise, he's just been trying
Mm.
to get in there every time. So,
Aw,
but yeah, it's just so nice to have this different experience into
absolutely.
in motherhood, and I really feel like I've now hit my
Hmm.
like my true potential
Oh,
as a mother rather than this yeah
that's
yeah
so lovely to
so,
hear. Wow.
yeah
What a healing story. Yeah, just especially being
yeah
a back as well and not even bringing that into the equation, and just knowing that you could do this and having such a beautiful birth at home, just in your shower.
yeah
Oh,
and still to this day she's always trying to crawl into the shower.
Oh
Like
yeah.
when I'm in the shower, she's really trying to get in there.
Oh,
So yeah,
wow.
she is gonna love the shower forever. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear of that story, and even your first story. Like, what a journey that
Mm.
must have been. And like you said, night and day, polar opposites between the birth, the postpartum of your first to the birth, the postpartum of your second. It's, yeah,
Yeah.
that's just such
I
a turnaround.
I feel I really had to go through that.
Mm,
And I had to have that,
mm,
somewhat level of adversity to really
mm,
come into my power and to
mm.
realize, because if I'd had an easy pregnancy and birth the first time round, maybe I wouldn't be where I am now,
Yeah.
and might not have decided to free birth, and it wouldn't have really set me on my course
Mm-hmm.
to realizing what my purpose is. And I
Mm-hmm.
now know, and that's to, is to help other women and support them and make them well aware that they can do this. Like
Yeah.
you have everything you need inside of yourself, and
Mm-hmm.
just trust in yourself, trust in your body, trust in your baby. It's so important that women know this. So
Mm,
like, I'm so grateful that you've given me this chance to be able to put that message out there so that women know, like, it doesn't matter if you are high risk, if you're a VBAC, all of those sorts of things, like, you can do this. You don't have to
mm.
just, yeah,
Yeah.
carry on down that wrong path. If that's the way that you first went, like, you can bring it back.
Yeah, you can make the
Right?
choice and change it, and it's just that
Yeah.
simple. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
and it's really helped with my mum as well in healing her birth trauma, because my sister
Mhm.
and I were both born by C-section. My sister an
Okay.
emergency C-section after a
Mhm.
failed induction. But
Yeah.
she was so uninformed, and then
Hmm.
me as the second child just scheduled in because
Yeah.
that's what they did. You've
Yeah.
had one C-section, so that automatically means that you need another, and she's really been able to unpeel all of those layers and see where it went wrong and
Yeah.
heal that for herself through
Um,
through my experience, which has just been,
yeah.
yeah, it's really
Wow.
been great for her.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love hearing stories of that, how the birth, the women that I speak to, the spiral heals, back to the past, to their mothers, even their grandmothers maybe, and then it's already brought in that healing for the child that they birthed, and especially if it's a female child that will one day have her own children if she chooses to when she's older. She that kind of chain of cesareans that has gone through, you broke it with your daughter. So, you know, I'm fairly certain and positive that she's going to have a very beautiful, in her full power, at home birth experience. And
Yeah,
she's not going to have to kind of go through those steps of, the trauma or those big lessons to bring in that healing, because it's already been done through her, through you, and that's just
yes,
so beautiful to see that it's just that story is now rewritten for yourself if you have more children, for her if she brings children, if you have more female children, even if your son, he has that energetic memory now and he can see that it can be different, and yeah, it's really beautiful. Like,
yeah,
birth is just so powerful. It's when birth is happens in the way that it's meant to truly happen, with a woman, a mother in her power throughout the pregnancy, the conception, even pregnancy and full birth and into postpartum mothering. When it happens as it's meant to happen, it
yeah,
literally creates the biggest ripples throughout everybody's lives. It's so incredible to witness, to see, to hear the stories of, because it's the biggest medicine, it's the biggest power that we have on this planet, I believe. It's, yeah, it's just, oh, so great.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. It's
Yeah.
just, it really is like,
Mhm.
heal birth, heal the earth. That's
Mhm.
just so,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
I feel so. I'm
Mhm.
just so glad that I've been able to do that in my
Mm-hmm.
part. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, nice. I
yeah.
thank you so much for sharing your story. Is there anything else that you'd like to share in any of your birth, pregnancy, birth, postpartum journeys for the listeners here today?
Oh gosh, just I don't know. Yeah, just tune in, really lean into your intuition.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the biggest thing because through doing that,
Mm-hmm.
only positives come. So, and that's where for me, my motherhood journey has really like flourished in
Mm-hmm.
just trusting in my intuition myself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, yeah, so,
Mm-hmm.
so important. And I want to start, sort of running circles so that women, those that didn't have, that feel they don't have the support in free birth, because there really aren't that many people. Like, I never knew anybody that had done it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I had one friend that 10 years ago had uh, an attempt at a home birth, but ended up transferred, into
Yeah.
hospital and then with an emergency C-section. So I
Mm,
just really want to provide space for women to be able to come and get that support,
yeah.
and sort of like the anti-mothers group, because the mothers groups that are out there are
Yeah.
so like that, oh, like what
Totally.
they discuss is just, but
Yeah.
just be these like radical free-spirited women that
Mm-hmm.
are doing things by themselves. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I
yeah, that's where
mean,
I'm leaning
that's perfect.
now more,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
towards working.
beautiful. And your
Yeah.
lived experience just brings so much power and strength into what you want to create. So, whomever shows up to these women's circles and sits next to you and hears your stories and speaks with you is just a woman that is being guided in the right direction. And I'm so grateful that you're doing that and you're stepping into that phase of your life and your mothering. And yeah, so if these women want to reach out to you, if they're in Australia or just anywhere around the world, how can they contact you?
On Instagram, my page is Conscious Mama Craft. So yeah, you can reach me there. I'm trying to be more consistent in my posting. I'm just,
Mm.
but two small children, it kind of
Mm.
yeah, gets away. But yeah, that's the best place
Oh,
from there. And then any updates on the circles, I will put on there. So I haven't got to the stage of a website yet, but that will come. So yeah,
oh,
yeah, that will
wonderful.
come. So I'm going to be homeschooling as well, so it's just kind of like
Mm.
however I can fit it
Mhm.
around. It's yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, I'm so
So
excited for everything that you are bringing into your future. And again, so grateful that you shared both of your stories because the first one is so powerful, especially because your son was born. What was it called again?
an omphalocele,
Omphalocele.
um,
Yeah, with his some
yeah,
of his organs outside his body, and just
yeah,
knowing that it's not as quote unquote high risk as it really needs to be, and you were really taken advantage of from the system because they know they can, and then seeing you come right back out of that and just claiming that power back like the fierce mama that you are is just so beautiful. And I'm really grateful that this story has been shared because you don't hear about it, you don't hear about outcomes the second time around usually, that the mother births so free and so in her power. So this is something that needs to be shared. And I'm so grateful
yeah.
that you've chosen this platform to do so. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, sisters, so much for listening to this episode of the Free Birthing in Color podcast. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one in a primal activation session, donate to the podcast, or to have your story featured here or in the blog, go to primalwomanportal.com for all the information to do so. Did you want to connect with our guest speaker? You can find all her information linked within the show notes. And if you have time, please subscribe, write a review, and tell a friend to have a listen so that this podcast and these stories of women birthing in their total power can be shared far and wide. Don't forget to check out the show notes for information on the Earth Daughters Women's Festival, the Breach Without Borders workshop, and much more. New episodes drop every Thursday morning, so stay tuned for the next amazing story to be shared on any platform that you prefer to listen to your podcasts on, or watch these episodes on the Free Birthing in Color YouTube page. And remember, your voice and your story matters. So if you're a woman of color or an Indigenous woman who's had a wild pregnancy and or birth outside of the medical system, submit your story because it's so important that your voice is heard and celebrated in your radical journey of pregnancy, birth, and motherhood.